Yeah, there was no goal in that. Yeah, it's been very hard. Moving here, even though it's the city itself is so big, it's been very hard to like. We want everything to be I'm like
There's a farm here. Well, we did this one.
right.
The eyes are sensitive. Yeah. There's all these things like I was
Good. How are you?
Congratulations on what's coming.
I'm actually standing around rubbing my belly. A lot of Buddha belly rubbing happening lately.
yeah.
Like, that won't be an issue like these actually. Well, because like I like built a little.
Yeah. We'll find it here.
You have your own. Oh, there we go. I think I just typed Oh yeah, this is the news article. My card is very small. There we go. Oh, that's really neat. Okay. What is the? That's very good. So, what do you do with it?
Yes, I know.
You get to make it work. I like the look. Like I feel you. You know what though? Another coffee for it.
Yeah.
Hurry up. I told myself. Exactly. Very nice. Why did you decide to work with them? That makes it like a little more exciting. Just imagine, like, I'm gonna start my organization, right? That's so cool. Why did you want to do it? What made you passionate about it? Oh yes, everyone will like okay.
Yeah, it's really.
So you find that art is really like bigger ideas we can do together.
Be more effective too.
Yeah.
Like my program is starting. And so that's what. No, that would be instead of trying to like sign outside now, one
Oh, yeah. Did you start the foundation?
that was one of the reasons.
Yeah.
Oh, you're right. Started it. How did you get here? Really? Which university? Oh, wait. You went to your university?
Well, I found an answer for human science.
Okay. All right. Very nice.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Good. Yeah.
Yes.
So I negotiated my way to now to art class.
I'm shocked he came to Notre Dame.
Oh.
I imagine Notre Dame. Oh, I have so many places.
Well, that was one of the reasons what I taught my teacher. That's interesting. I didn't. For instance, history.
Or
I'm not this big.
Yeah, it took me a while to make it happen, I have to say.
I really read like pillars and what you know.
Yeah.
And then one of the first times I ended up having students who crazy. So I was like, moment, okay, we're actually about to make this. Doing this, we ended up I've been there many times.
Yeah. That's really.
Yeah. Yeah, no. I live in There's gotta be a really good reason. There's lots of different reasons to be in. Check that fucking wait, like, but you better do it then. Teach my son how to drive right now. It's true.
It's totally true. I have like
Probably fit. Although I mostly just go out. I don't do it much. And election is like, so we're actually our next one,
finding parking in that area.
well, and then of course being in
Dare I ask?
Oh,
Oh, really? Funding side or like?
okay.
Oh,
We live in
oh wow. All the time. Do something. Right. Yeah. 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 I hear you. I hear you. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. And I think whatever we have will fill all of our time plus 5 minutes. So if you only have one thing that you're doing, it'll fill all of your time. Or if you have 8 things that you're doing, it'll fill your entire time. And it's the Washington challenge. It is. Yeah. You constantly. Right. Right. And present and right. And on top of everything.
Still got more jobs.
Right, which otherwise you get.
Good. I feel like that's what you're saying. Yes, please. Good. Classes are going well. I teach a class this semester that's like a consulting class on human rights. So our students work for the State Department or work for Freedom House or a different NGO and doing a project. So it's really exciting. There's just a lot of anxiety. All graduates. Yeah. So within ours, I oversee all of our students who do foreign policy and national security. So a wide range of different interests. But there's just a lot of anxiety right now with what's going on in the country and what does that mean for how I'm engaged in the world, and like a lot of this stuff not named in this stuff, but just they're not old enough to know how to cope. And they don't have enough good experience under their belt. They're I don't know if it's just that they're hard drivers, so they're like, I'm gonna be type A about my anxiety, and I'm gonna be good at anxiety, right? And I'm gonna be the best anxious person. But they're really, so a lot of it is just sort of guiding them, bucking them up to like get in the game, right? You're here, you're a Georgetown student, like go out and change the world. Like, yeah, it's terrible, but so that's a lot of our time. But just doing work also on the whole issue of sort of democracy, democracy as part of our foreign policy. Because I gotta get kids looking at what does that mean? Because I think that we're looking at like that issue falling off the agenda for a lot of the people in the next generation because they haven't had the wins and the losses and the knowledge of what it looks like, right? They've been educated in sort of a 9/11 Iraq world. And just what does that look like as part of our foreign policy to have democracy as an element? So, see how that goes. So.
I just did that for a while. All right, nice job.
Any question? Concept of sovereignty. Yep.
This is Rhonda from Pillars.
Oh, hi.
Hi,
Nice to meet you.
Who's the managing director of the Public Grant Program at Democracy Fund and my boss. So she's working on our grant proposal. We were talking about it earlier this morning.
So I was just uploading documents right now. I found the Wi-Fi password.
There you go.
You're all DC.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm in Chicago. Yeah, I'm originally from St. Louis.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
And in Chicago. I really love it.
Yeah, I think that's the question. Is how do you educate people? I always say it's like teaching someone how to swim during a
Excited to get an
right?
application.
Like,
Yes.
swimming is still swimming, and all the same skills and knowledge you still need, but everything around you is swirling. How do you keep them engaged? How do you not make them
Photos of her kid.
and not put on Instagram anxiety?
Like I literally screenshot her kid and sent it back to her. So yeah.
Unfortunately,
Have you remember Bree?
hey, you're from St. Louis?
Yeah. You didn't know that?
She was asking me earlier.
Sophomores. I'm trying to do
Thank you.
I
grew up in South Carolina.
I thought, yeah. And then he told me about a new organization called
Where are you from? We have many Pakistani friends.
And then other people.
point. That is an excellent point.
Oh my gosh.
So that's good to know that you're connected.
You know,
Still to there. Okay, good. So
we go out 2/7.
I don't know if I ever told you that's what I do. Yeah, so like trying to plan around and
Cultural consulting.
other organizations. Oh, it's great to like get I'm also looking for like ethnically, racially diverse people.
Yeah, we need to find that.
Hello and welcome back. Hopefully your bellies are full, your minds are alert. We talked a lot about the United States and we're now going to turn to the rest of the world. And with that, I'll turn it to Nicole Bivens-Sadaka.
Welcome and good afternoon. The only thing harder than following lunch is probably trying to pivot from a very rich and dynamic discussion about all of the challenges in this country to talk about the simple issues of what's going on in the entire world. But that's what we're going to do for the next hour and a half or so. I'm delighted to be joined on this panel with three experts who have very, very deep experience in a number of countries, which offer great case studies for us to look at these issues of religious nationalism, pluralism, what does citizenship mean in the context of the countries that they have been studying for many, many years. So to my left is Dr. Anand Young, who is the chair of the history department at University of Washington, and he's also a professor in the Henry M. Jackson School of International Affairs at that university. He started his specialization in South Asian history, particularly on colonial India, and has now broadened his area of academic focus to include comparative studies on India, China, and other global leaders. To his left is Dr. Rashat Kasaba, who is the director of the Stanley Golub Chair of International Studies, also at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Affairs. And his area of research is focused on the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, and the Middle East. Has recently written a book called A Movable Empire, the Ottoman Empire, Migrants and Refugees. Probably a story that has many, many additions to be written in the case of modern day Turkey. And to his left, Susan Hayward, who is the Senior Advisor for Religion and Inclusive Societies at the United States Institute of Peace. And she directs the efforts to advance conflict prevention, resolution, and reconciliation that involves engaging the religious sector. She has worked in Sri Lanka and many other places around the world and has focused her work on Colombia, Iraq, and Burma, Myanmar, and we're particularly delighted, given all of her recent travels there, that she'll be able to bring that expertise particularly to our conversation. So I will start with a general question that will set the stage for what is going on in each of these countries, Turkey, India, and Burma, in the context of what we're talking about, religious nationalism, pluralism, and citizenship. From the perspective of the countries that you all have been studying, what do these terms mean? What do they look like currently? Dr. Young, if you could start us off.
Sure. The taxi driver I took recently was a Pakistani. And when I discovered that, I started to speak to him in Urdu. And he perhaps, without my saying anything about this event, said, perhaps, I don't know whether he was being generous about my seemingly East Asian identity or my Indian identity, he said, Allah ke bande hai sab, meaning everybody is a child of we're all children of God, is what he said. And I guess that was one of the echoes rippling through the first two panels about religious pluralism. But I'm also, as a historian, reminded of that India is a country of about 1.4 billion people, where about 80% of the population is Hindu, but over 14% of it is Muslim, which means over 200 million people, 300 million people, 200 million people who are Muslims. So a country that is so much more diverse than the United States. And one of the ways it's dealt with this diversity from its very birth is in the hands of Gandhi, and India chose not to go in that direction, where Gandhi was this very devout Hindu, but the kind of Hindu in the months leading up to his assassination in January 1948 used to have hymns played at his prayer meetings, which were sort of basically saying, whether you name your God as Allah, whether you name your God as Ishwar or God, we're all the same, and would have passages read from the Bible, the Sikh Granths, and other kinds of books. So that kind of vision, and Nehru's other kind of vision of a very secular India, and great skepticism towards religion. He was the kind of person who believed in science and thought religion was the opium of the masses. And this shows up in the way India is created. And I start with that beginning to emphasize that although the Constitution of India emphasizes the secularity of India, it does not provide certain kinds of religious guarantees that were never written into the Constitution because it didn't recognize certain kinds of rights for minorities. And this is played out in recent years with the rise of a Hindu nationalist party, which in some ways anticipates what happens in the United States to many extent. And many South Asianists would say that in recent US elections, they really took a playbook out of what Narendra Modi used to rise to power. One hand is make India great was one of his messages, so this kind of development kind of issue. And the other one, which he himself didn't say, but his lieutenants did, Hindu first, make India Hindu first. And so there's this sort of tension which by the Constitution, there aren't the guarantees in place when the state is the power that uses persecution, fear, oppression to keep minorities in place, particularly Muslim minorities. And when I was in Delhi this past July, one of my Muslim friends said to me, I have never felt as endangered in India as I do now.
Wow.
So let me sort of end there.
Wow.
Well,
Saba, how did it look like?
so thank you very much. It is really nice to be here. I learned a lot, and a lot of the conversation this morning, I was surprised how much parallels I could find with what I was hearing and with what I know about Turkey, especially, and the Middle East at large. I just want to, and also hearing Anand, it's interesting, there are so many parallels also with what India is going through and what Turkey is going through. Just want to say a couple of things to start off with. Most discussions about Turkey today start with our president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, which I think there is a reason for that because he has really dominated Turkish politics now, increasingly single-handedly since at least early 2000s, but this has become particularly pronounced in the last 5 years or so. I'll come back to that. But what I think people sometimes forget by focusing on the present and one figure so much is that there is a historical context that led to the rise of Erdogan and the current situation in Turkey. Many of you probably know that Turkey went through. I mean, that Turkey emerged out of a fairly catastrophic turn of the 20th century wars and conflicts. It was one of the states that emerged out of the Ottoman Empire, but it really claims for itself to be the core sort of inheritor of that imperial tradition. But of course, there were some interesting, important breaks between the Ottoman past and the modern Turkey. And one of them was this complete sort of elimination of religious diversity that defined the Ottoman Empire. Cities like Istanbul, Izmir, major cities in Turkey today, where anywhere between 2/3, half non-Muslim, until the very early years of the 20th century. And today, the non-Muslims are not even a minority. They're so small in all across the country. So what came in its place, this imperial diversity was replaced with a fairly strict nationalist regime, and it claimed to be, of course, everybody knows, a strictly secular nationalist regime. Among other things, the early Republican ideology in Turkey was that the religion was what really led to the downfall of the Ottoman Empire, and it was especially Islam that really kept Turkey or Ottomans backward in relationship to Europe. So this was pronounced, but in practice, this was a very much a Muslim nation. It was not pronounced, but there were very well known sort of customs and laws that prevented non-Muslims from occupying important positions in the government, being elected to the parliament, or being, even though they had to serve in the army, they could not occupy higher ranks. So there was a distrust towards non-Muslim, and this has historical reasons. So this Muslim identity was very much ingrained, overlaid with this secular kind of ideology that was pro-Western, that was pronounced by Atatürk. Now, I think this led in Turkey this kind of development of two spheres, state and society, state and non-state, in a parallel but completely insular fashion for most of the 20th century. With the recent rise of the Justice and Development Party and its predecessors that go back to mid-60s and 70s, what we saw is that this non-state area that was far away, mostly rural, in provincial places, became more and more prominent in Turkish politics. And this is really the rise of Islam as a political force, I think, is very much related to that. I want to say also that with the Justice and Development Party, this has been in power now since 2001, 2002, and it was actually one of the most, initially, one of the most pronounced possibilities of merging these two insular spheres together. In other words, really in a productive, creative way, bringing Islam into Turkish politics, into Turkish mainstream. What has happened today, what's going on today is, for, again, reasons that have to do with domestic and international politics, the government in Turkey has become increasingly, once again, insular, state-centered, and going back to, in fact, in some ways, the early 20th century top-to-bottom kind of policies. So it is the state tradition, if you want to call it. This was secular in earlier forms. Today, it is much more sort of blended with religion, but it is a similar tradition in that it pushes away civil society organizations. It pushes away any sort of challenge that may come to its power from other parts of the country. And this includes, which is a very important factor for Turkish Islam in Turkey, this includes some of the religious orders that played a very important role in Turkish Muslim politics. Naqshbandis and Nurcu tarikats and the whole Gülen movement is related to that. So pushing away any possibility of decentralization and sort of distribution of power away from the center and concentrating as much control as possible in the center, I think is what's happening. The other part of it is the foreign policy. They try to combine this with a projection of Turkey as an Islamic power in the Middle East and other parts of the world, going all the way to actually to Myanmar. But it is that has its own sort of problems, which we can talk about later on.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. Yeah, Susan. First of all, thank you. It's wonderful to be here in conversation with all of you, and I'm glad that we have this panel because I think there's a lot that America can learn from contexts around the world. And it's not really in our DNA as Americans to look elsewhere for advice and recommendations about how we can better manage our diversity. But now, if ever, is a good time for us to be looking elsewhere to see what lessons we can learn in our polarized environment. So, like India, Myanmar is mind-bogglingly diverse. It has 135 recognized ethnic groups, and within those various ethnic groups, there is diversity of language, diversities of religious practices and cultural practices. So even that number 135 doesn't really capture the degree of diversity that exists within Myanmar. It does have an ethnic majority, the Bamar, and it has a religious majority, the Buddhist. And Buddhism is practiced by many of the ethnic minority groups as well, but the religious minority groups tend to be ethnic minorities. So in other words, Bamar are almost exclusively Buddhist. And then groups like the Chin and Kachin, who practice Christianity, are distinguished from the Bamar Buddhist majority by both their ethnic and their religious diversity. But at the same time, there are ethnic minorities who practice Buddhism. So this begins to get at the web of complications that come into play when you're trying to parse out exactly what religion has to do with it, ethnicity has to do with it, issues of political power play between civilian and military power have to do with the current context in Myanmar. A couple quick historical points that I want to point out, just like Rizat did with Turkey, because it bears incredible importance in understanding the contemporary situation. And that has to do with Myanmar being a post-colonial context and Myanmar being a conflict context. So post-colonial is important to understand because of the experience of the British coming in and severing the relationship between religion and the state that had previously existed, where the state's responsibility was in part to give protection and support to the Buddhist Sangha so that it could practice the Buddhist faith and ensure the spiritual health of the nation. Having the state support it kind of freed up the monks and the nuns and the other monastics to be able to engage in spiritual practices that were seen to benefit the state politically, but also the society more widely. And so when the Brits came in and broke off that relationship of patronage and support, it led to a perception and a reality of the weakening of the monastic order. And that's important because now in this context, there's a sense that the state, from the post-colonial context onward, with independence, there was a desire to restore the importance of the state-religion relationship and being mutually supportive of one another, and a sense that it was precisely foreign influence that led to the weakening of Buddhism in Myanmar. And that anti-foreign mentality that I think marks a lot of post-colonial contexts, but that sense too that foreign influences lead to a weakening of Buddhism in the state is very much alive today. As well, during that colonial period, there was more of a push for lay to be involved in helping to protect and promote Buddhism in a way that previously hadn't existed, and that plays out as well too. And then civil war. So because a lot of there's over a dozen ethnic insurgency groups, because of the correlation between ethnic minority and religious minority in the country, and because of this understanding of, or the fear of foreign influence and association with Christianity and Islam in particular, with foreign influence and foreign relationships, a lot of the ways in which religious minorities are treated come back to some of these issues of the state's conflicts with ethnic insurgency groups. So targeting of religious minority communities or perceptions of religious minority communities come very caught up in these discussions about security and wherein lies insecurity or threats to the state. And it might be more about that than it is about anti-Christianity or anti-Islam per se, but it all gets interwoven with one another in ways that are hard to disentangle. So now briefly, the contemporary moment where we have a very swift political change that began in 2010 when the military began a top-down political transition to introduce democracy, and it led to vast changes almost overnight and the opening up of Myanmar to all kinds of foreign influences, to economic changes, to social changes and influences coming in. And at the same time, there's this restructuring of the state and a lot of competition that is going on in order to define what the state is going to look like and who it's going to benefit moving forward. And this has unleashed a lot of very latent prejudices and biases that have existed for a long time in Myanmar. It's unleashed some of the anti-foreign prejudices and concerns and anxieties, and it's all playing out in a really messy democratic, quasi-democratic process with new media freedoms that can sometimes exploit misinformation and bias through these new media formats. But which also, I mean, democracy is a system that was created in part to deal with pluralism, right, through non-violent means. It creates a structure by which conflict between different groups can be managed through a bureaucratic system in a way that prevents us from going towards violence, ideally. But we know that democracy has dangers as well with electoral politics, in particular in campaigns. And so we see some of that reality playing out in Myanmar right now, too, with electoral politics and campaigning and some of the competition between various political groups feeding then on some of these religious prejudices and exacerbating them in this collusion between political elites and economic elites and religious elites that then has led to horrible atrocities against the Rohingya Muslim ethnic community in particular, but it has also had repercussions for other ethnic and religious groups in the countries as this continues to play out.
Mm-hmm. 3 fascinating and challenging countries, all different states of their democratic governance as well, consolidated, maybe backsliding, emerging but not emerging at the same time. Each of you talked about how the state played a very big role in consolidating power, often by defining it by one group or a specific group in that process. And part of that was a secular identity, I would say in the first 2 that we heard, that secular identity was meant to sort of save the country from all of this messy diversity. So clearly you have extraordinarily diverse societies that didn't handle that diversity by recognizing or leaning into that diversity, but rather by either consolidating it in the hands of one or saying that it will be in the hands of none to some extent. Let me start with you, Rashad, and just if you could talk about where you've seen the state and the civil society grappling with these issues of religious pluralism well and not so well.
So when I talked about this emergence of modern Turkey, secular Turkey, and elimination of Christians with the genocide of Armenians and the population exchange that really got rid of the Greek population, which was quite large, and especially the western parts of the country. What was left behind was assumed to be all homogeneous community of Turks, which of course was not entirely correct. As I said, there was Muslim identity was very much ingrained, but also it was a diverse community. There is among these Muslims, 25% of them are Alevis, which are a Shia branch. And also, of course, there is again a 25% Kurdish population, which doesn't, there's some overlaps religiously, but they don't consider themselves definitely Turks. So there is this historical diversity, how Turkey came to be, what it was, but also the existing diversity. I would say that with both of them, Turkey did not deal very well. Doesn't deal with it well today, but it didn't deal with this very well in the earlier parts of the 20th century. The curriculum in Turkish public schools has no really accurate account of Turkey's recent history. You can actually go through schools in Turkey, which I did until I came to this country, without learning anything about Armenians or Greeks. I had to come here to this country to really learn some of that history. But it is also true with religion. There is in earlier times, it was optional, but now there's a mandatory course on Islam that all school children have to take. But this is really Sunni Islam that is taught, which of course excludes, not only excludes, but in some versions considers Alevis or Shiites, not even proper Muslims. And that is, again, a sizable minority in Turkey, which is not included in this national conversation. So I think that kind of, somebody mentioned today, I think in relationship to Native Americans in this country, indigenous communities, that if you don't have a sort of a common discourse, you can't really have a community. And I think that is really true for Turkey. And that really continues to undermine whatever you can call a national unity or you know, sort of common sense of purpose. So that is, I am becoming increasingly interested in this issue of you know, cross-cultural literacy, but also education, how it develops in different contexts and what purpose it serves. In the case of Turkey, and I suspect it's the same in India, that was a very important tool in the hands of the founders of modern state, sort of generating, training this new generation of people like myself, my parents' generation, who would have a very pre-formulated sense of what that history was and what that community is.
Excellent. Susie, how do you see it in the context of Burma in the sense of the role that the government has played to either create, what I'm hearing is the need for a super identity that recognizes the diversity. This is in the ideal, obviously, a super identity that recognizes the diversity, and yet does what a responsible state should do. Where have you seen the government either making strides in that, we know where they're failing tremendously, or where you've seen civil society able to advance some sort of a vision for that super identity that would bring some sort of unity to some extent of a very, very, very diverse society without negating the reality of their individual communities?
Yeah, I think most of the positive examples come from civil society at the current moment. Even the NLD, the National League of Democracy, the Aung San Suu Kyi's party and the biggest opposition party, is primarily seen as a Bamar majority party that is advancing kind of Bamar Buddhist interests, maybe in more subtle forms than the military party, but nonetheless that underscores their priorities and the ways in which they operate, where they spend their time, who they spend their time with. At the same time, I mean, so the civil wars broke out in the independence period in part over this issue of, is Burma going to be a Buddhist country? And how are we going to manage, how is the state going to manage religion? What is its relationship with religion and religions going to be? Is it going to fund religious education? Is it going to fund religious institutions? If so, which religious institutions? I mean, it was those very issues, but also just the very theoretical meta question of, is the Burmese nation Buddhist or not? And the contestation over that, in the sense that ethnic minorities and religious minorities felt that they weren't a part of this Bamar Buddhist nation that led to the civil wars breaking out in the first place. And that question has still not been answered. And so the peace process that's going on right now hasn't yet touched on that issue of what is the Ministry of Religion going to look like, and what is it going to do moving forward in a federalized system, and what is going to be the place of Buddhism in the Constitution. It's a secular country in the sense that it It allows for freedom of religion in the Constitution. It protects the rights of all religious communities to be able to express and practice their faith, at least on paper and legalistically. It's a secular institution in that sense, but it's not a secular institution in the sense we might think of in the US as that clear separation between state and religion, such that the state isn't defining what orthodoxy is. But what you do have going on at the moment within civil society, I mean, with the NLD, when it came into power, it did do a number of things in order to lift up and celebrate diversity within the state. It tends to be performative, going back to what we were talking about before, and doesn't actually kind of critically engage with the policies and priorities and institutions and the ways in which racism and so on is embedded within those institutions. But it did at least crack down on the permissive environment that had existed that allowed some of these very prejudicial racial narratives, especially articulated by Buddhist nationalist groups, to flourish under the military government. But civil society has been doing a lot in trying to combat hate speech in order to strengthen media literacy, so people don't necessarily, so that they critically engage with the narratives that they hear and see, especially on social media, in order to introduce into religious education and into some of the government public education teachings about other religious traditions. So at the very least, there's a little bit of religious literacy across religious traditions as well. Historically, people just studied the religion of their family for the religious education school system. But even those small steps, there can be a lot of pushback against that with other sectors of civil society. So I also don't want to paint all of the civil society efforts as positive, because that too is a contested space for addressing these issues.
In India, where do we see positive signs of bridging the gap between an institutional structure that is for one or for none and the diversity of a society? And does that also come more from a localized level? I mean, India is a highly developed sub-state structure, or is it driven by civil society? Are there places where there are bright lights or where there's positive movement in that sense?
Well, I think what's happened is that state power, whether in the form of rhetoric, whether in the form of its practices, as well as its institutions, are increasingly arrayed against sort of the pluralism that we used to think existed at the everyday level in India. I think a lot of that has disappeared. It used to be said that one of the reasons why India functioned so effectively as this messy, noisy democracy was the cleavages and diversity were so great that everybody felt he or she was a minority. Whether it was religion, whether it was caste, whether it was language, whether it was history, there were so many different ways where everybody felt. Now that divide is along religious lines, where being a citizen in India means being Hindu, which in right-wing language means even if you're a Muslim, to be an Indian, you are Hindu. And being a good Hindu means fine to read the Quran, but you have to read it in a South Asian language. It's sort of a very different time. And as yet, I haven't seen large numbers of civil society groups emerging to defend the rights, because Modi's victory was such a landslide victory in 2014. And he's really brought the power of the states behind this kind of division between Hindus and Muslims. So it's emerging in some parts of India, but not in sort of the North Indian heartland, where Hindu nationalists are really well entrenched and where they have swept elections, including just recently.
Absolutely. So to get to the practical, what turns that around? Because what I'm hearing in all of the cases is what we need is leadership, either grassroots or top down, that is going to recognize the diversity of the society, engage the civil society, and create this identity, which both respects the minority, but also creates an identity that everyone can buy into. Where does that impetus come from? Is that something in the, and I'll start with you, Susie, can that come from the outside? Is it something that the United States or the EU or the UN or other agencies can be thinking about? If it's not, does it come from inside, and how do you do that when half the government is military? Do we just have to wait? Where is that impetus? Because we're talking here about pretty big ideas, which the United States is really not doing well, as we heard on our panels this morning, and we have a long way to go. How does that look in a country where you're dealing with massive human rights violations, massive diversity, a lack of democratic history? Where does that impetus come from?
Well, it has to come from inside, in part too, because it's a post-colonial context. For all the things that I was saying before, it has to come from inside and be seen as indigenous, and be rooted in the history and the reality of the multiple narratives and experiences within Myanmar. And there are places where it exists right now. The thing is, though, it can't just be a narrative. I mean, yes, we need the vision of the multiplicity of nationalisms that exist in Myanmar as, you know, the melting pot or the mixed salad or whatever, however they're going to articulate it for Myanmar. But it also, narratives are lovely and beautiful and mobilizing and symbolically incredibly important, but you also have to have a state that has institutions that reflect that vision as well. And so as long as you have a state that is set up to benefit one community at the expense of other communities, or a state and its security operations that are set up to see minorities as a threat to itself and its very existence, then you can have the nicest narrative in the world, but it's not going to change. It's not going to create social cohesion when there's this discrimination by the state that's embedded in the very way in which it was set up in the post-independence period. So the narrative has to be indigenous. There's already a great deal there. There's a historical memory of communities living together side by side. There's a great deal of appreciation and pride, I think. There's a lot within Theravada Buddhist ethics and values and philosophical understandings that all of this can be a part of the mix that develops this kind of multiplicity, this you know, their own version of a pluribus unum. But it has to come alongside the creation of a state system that reflects that narrative and that vision.
So I'm hearing narrative, I'm hearing education, I'm hearing institutions. Just keeping my list of the to-do list on a meta level. Let me ask you, I know, I do everything in to-do lists. Let me ask you, where does that impetus come from? Is it something that you see growing within civil society or other leaders? And how does that balance those strongholds where that's not the narrative and there's not that desire to create that identity that's both respectful and inclusive?
Yeah, I completely agree with Susan that it's got to come from within. Unfortunately, what I see happening across India is the current government extending its power in all these different spheres where the state didn't formally have as much control as it does. This is everything from textbooks to higher education to newspapers to sort of controlling media to controlling the narrative. And because the mandate that the current prime minister received in the 2014 elections was so huge that he really swept to power, and with it swept away this whole earlier narrative and institutions to sort of enact that kind of narrative. What used to be summed up in one of Nehru's favorite phrases, unity and diversity. No one talks about that anymore. It's not the watchword of what makes India tick. It's a very different kind of, and the US has very little it can do. Not that the current administration or previous administration was interested in interfering in these kinds of matters. Briefly, as many of you will recall, there was a visa ban against Modi after the 1992 riots in Gujarat, but that was as soon as he was elected. You don't do that to a head of state who is a key partner in this emerging Indo-Pacific strategy, a game that the United States is now playing across Asia-Pacific.
Yeah.
Well, I agree with my colleagues, but I think Turkey is a little bit perhaps different. And I think in Turkish case, which I think is also true with some other cases in the Middle East, external actors are very important in the sense that I think they're now playing a role that is strengthening precisely the kind of forces that make it impossible for civil society and non-state actors to play a prominent role. Now, if you remember, like Modi, Erdogan, when he first came to power, he was a different kind of leader. For the first time, he allowed Kurdish language broadcasts in televisions, Kurdish language education in schools. Mayors from his party led the way in repairing Armenian churches in the east. They were open to worship. So it looked like a completely different kind of attitude towards diversity, history, which Turkey hadn't seen until that moment. And I will say that a couple of things happened, of course. One is, the whole Arab Spring, its aftermath, and in Turkey, this environmental movement that really threatened his regime for over 2 months. People were camped in the middle of Istanbul, demanding all kinds of things. So that I think is really that was a threat to the power. And the other thing that happened, I think, is there was a sense that this opening up that was really going on in Turkey was partly being done in an attempt to join the European Union, to come to better terms with European institutions, and that was not reciprocated in a very strong terms by Sarkozy at the time, saying that there was no way Turkey was ever going to become a member. And then later on, with the turn of the tide, right now, what we see is the European Union, in a way, is aiding the Turkish state in doing the kinds of things that it is doing domestically for its own interests in their own countries, in their own region. So that absent that kind of encouragement, I think there is a entrenchment of this policies that make it impossible for non-state actors to play any kind of constructive role in Turkey. The young people are trying to leave because they don't see any future in the country, which is very bad. If you think about the future of a place like Turkey. So I think that kind of external encouragement, I think in the Turkish case, was important in opening up this space for broader participation and for civil society, and that's being restricted domestically for domestic political reasons, and internationally, again, for international reasons. And I should also say, again, final word about the Turkish case. For people, no matter what their place is in the society, seeing how the Iraqi state and the Syrian state collapsed, and the anarchy, the total destruction that led into, really led people to be very fearful of any kind of situation where you have a weak state that can actually lead to a similar kind of situation. So that fear is also leading people to really not to challenge power.
Can I just add one sentence?
You bet.
So it doesn't sound horribly bleak and pessimistic. I mean, as long as India remains a vibrant democracy, there's always hope that things might change.
Yeah.
And as long as India remains a federal structure, there are states within India that go in a different direction. So,
Well, let me just do a quick speed round, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. Exactly on that point, do you see places where there are groups coming together, interfaith, different faiths, different ethnic groups coming together in their sort of minority status, arguing for a stronger structural development, arguing for greater democratic institutions that wouldn't necessarily benefit
their group specifically, but would rather create a level playing field, an inclusive playing field from which they then could advance their interests, practice worship freely, or whatever their group's interest is. Do you see any interfaith or different groups coming together for that sort of pan-Indian development?
I think here's where the parallels between the United States and India sort of fall apart. Hinduism is not the kind of religion where there is a Rome or a Mecca, or there's a pope, or there's a single leader who can call to the faithful and say, let's engage in. So at the local level, there may be different sort of local denominations that are interested in interfaith dialogue, but at the national level or at a larger or mass level, I haven't seen it happening as yet.
I see. And how about in Turkey's case?
Well, I think two ways we can talk about the presence of that kind of tendency. One is on the level of the faith groups in Turkey. Islam tends to be organized around these tarikats and religious orders, which are numerous, and they're widespread, and their views about society, history, culture varies along a very long spectrum. So you can find possibilities there. On the other hand, you have vibrant organizations that are based in cities, organized around art and culture and education, and they do create knowledge that can support that kind of tendency. But the power of the state has become so strong that as soon as any of these movements or organizations appears to pose a challenge, they are very forcefully limited. Even you may have seen just 2 weeks ago these mothers who were protesting or asking for the fate of their children who were disappeared 20 years ago. Some of them over 70, 80 years old were dragged from streets because they just it was felt that it was challenging the state. So it's a situation that's, I think, quite bleak in some ways, but at the same time, we are always surprised. I mean, nobody predicted the Arab Spring, which didn't end up very well, but it was a genuine kind of movement that came from below to challenge the authority across some of these very restrictive states in the Middle East. So even those of us who know Turkey very well may still be surprised.
We hope. Susie.
There are some awesome examples from
Good,
Myanmar
some
at the local
positive
level,
news.
at the local level of communities showing a great deal of resilience in the midst of some of these tensions rising, and being able, because they already have the relationships in place, being able to kind of steel themselves against some of the outside forces that are trying to turn them against each other, whether those forces are political or economic or whatever. And they don't, of course, they don't get the media attention because they're nil cases, right? Like you're going to be, the media is going to focus on the Miktilas and the Lashios and the places where there's been this intercommunal violence that's broken out in Rakhine State, but not necessarily in these places where it should have, where there were these same rumors that were percolating and the tensions were rising between communities, but then there were people within those communities who stepped up and dealt with the issue, investigated the rumors to find out that they were baseless, brought the communities together and ratcheted down the tensions so that violence didn't break out. There's also been really incredible work done by youth and by women in particular. So the youth tend to kind of be ahead of the sort of the clerical leaders often in some of the interfaith work, and bringing together people across different faith communities in order to challenge some of the, especially Islamophobic narratives, and to promote the idea of one Myanmar and appreciation for diversity. They did their own sticker campaigns that were a direct challenge to some of the sticker campaigns of the Buddhist nationalist groups that were promoting anti-Islamic narratives. And then women in particular, some of the most kind of vociferous organizations within Myanmar society that have stood up for the Rohingya have been some of the women's organizations who have particularly the Karen Women's Group in particular, who saw the ways in which Rohingya women were being violently treated by the Burmese military and others, and saw in their experience something they knew that they had experienced themselves within Karen state. And so reaching out to them and defending them in solidarity with them as women. So those are all wonderful examples of how civil society has mobilized in particular ways in order to defend and protect social cohesion and diversity. But again, I want to come back to and that in concert with some of the activities and programs that have been funded by the international community to support interfaith dialogue around the country in various forms. Those are all incredibly useful and contribute to the creation of social cohesion in the country, but that kind of horizontal work in and of itself only gets you partway there. You still, social cohesion also depends on the vertical, on how the state treats different communities. And so it's finding that linkage between doing that work horizontally, doing the work to address social prejudices and discrimination, and connecting that to some of the structural forms of violence and discrimination that still needs to be a lot of efforts done.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, let me open it up to our audience. Yeah, right here in the front.
Majid Al-Sayed from the Dialogue Institute in Philadelphia. And my question is on Turkey. Erdogan has been in recent years a rising star in the Middle East, especially amongst Muslim Brotherhood organizations. They see him as developing a third way, an autocrat using Islamic principles, growing the economy in a great way, although he's done it with a lot of debt. This past year, that debt has been coming due. The currency's dropped 40% this year alone, yet he's kind of controls the central bank, he controls the judiciary, he controls the government. There will be repercussions internally and externally in the region, depending on what happens with his rule. Could you talk to that somewhat? Will this exacerbate tensions internally with minority groups? Will it damage his image as a third-way Muslim leader in the region?
Yes. Well, I think it is true that Turkey is facing a very, very serious economic problem, which has, people are expecting this to come to a head. It hasn't yet because there is still the possibility of finding some short-term flow from outside to finance this debt, which is huge. So my personal view is that this has become so big, and it is really becoming even more and more serious. At some point, it will be impossible to deal with it. And that is why I think there is quite a bit of conflict within the government about how to deal with this. 2 weeks ago, they decided to hire McKinsey, an American firm, going to sort of have a oversight role over Turkish economy, which was really promoted as a way of bringing this crisis to a solution and making Turkey, again, attractive for foreign investment. But then this was criticized by nationalist groups. What are we doing? We're once again giving our budget to foreigners, etc. So even though his own son-in-law was really promoting this idea, Erdogan came yesterday and said, we're not going to do this. We won't deal with foreigners, and we'll deal with our own economic problems. So there seems to be a disarray in terms of, and it doesn't really generate any kind of confidence, I think, on the part of people who are investing in Turkey. So I think internationally, you're absolutely right. For a very long time, really deliberately, Turkey cultivated this image of an Islamic leader. And I think that was also, in a way, that didn't really work out very well either, because I think that was all premised on the possibility that Muslim Brotherhood will stay in power in Egypt, and that would become a main axis sort of cooperation that would expand Turkish-Egypt sort of cooperation in other parts of the region. That didn't happen. Now, Turkey has practically no relations with Egypt. It's in bad terms with Syria, obviously, with Saudi Arabia, which seems to be getting worse now with this recent incident. So even though the people, may look up to him still as this different kind of leader that is standing up to the West and doing all these things, but I think the problems and where Turkey is as a country are so complicated and so big that I think it will be increasingly difficult to deal with them on the current path.
Excellent. There's a question here, Catherine.
I'm Catherine Marshall from Georgetown University. I'd be interested in how you think in each of the situations the changing roles of women are affecting the kind of issues we're dealing with. And I think that has at least two faces. One is sort of women as you could say, victims of violence, but also the changing patterns of education and leadership. But also, as Susan had mentioned, the activist roles. How does that play out?
Want to start, Anand?
Sure. I think all the different roles you've described, you see women in assuming those roles. And of course, India has had a prime minister, head of state, who was a woman for a very long time and was quite successful in part of her terms. But at the same time, we've also had these horrific headlines recently of rapes and high incidence of rapes across India. And I think that's also another side. So I think women are emerging increasingly, but there are also major issues, whether it's the way women are treated in public in certain parts of India, to honor killings, to other kinds of developments that speak of a very different kind of narrative.
Can I just build on that before we check in with the other two panelists? The fact that women, to build on the first part, suffer in the sense of being a victim, regardless of faith and regardless of community, has that brought some unity, the way Susie was sharing, some unity among women from different backgrounds or different faiths or different castes, given their united sisterhood as opposed to their faith communities or opposed to their ethnic or other background?
I think about certain kinds of issues, yes, violence against women, yes, people have come together. But on other kinds of issues, politics, caste, religion, et cetera, have divided them.
I see. Thank you.
So you probably know the whole secular movement in Turkey in the early 20th century, one of its main plans was sort of liberating women, giving women right to vote before many European countries even, and opening up, education, etc. So that was seen as a symbol of Westernization and modernization, especially in 1930s and 1940s. Interestingly enough, between that time and really most of the 20th century, the trend was in the opposite direction. You saw declining participation of women in the workforce, declining visibility of women in public spaces, and that is really, there are explanations for that. But that trend once again changed, interestingly, when the Justice and Development Party first came to power. They were very, very conscious about allowing their women who were part of their movement, to be out there in their religious clothes, with their hijab, with their headscarves, and do the kinds of things that they were told that they couldn't do by the secular elite for, in previous decades. So even though this was a party that was based on Turkey's Islamic, kind of politics, it really had the largest number of representatives, women, female representatives, and really, and not all of them. Also, some of them didn't wear headscarves, and also they very consciously, of course, promoted women in the public space the way they want to be in the public space, covered everything. And the other thing that happened in Turkey, of course, is we didn't mention in the time when Justice and Development Party has been in power, we also have the rise of a very wealthy, very well accomplished, what you can call a Muslim bourgeoisie. So these are people with a lot of disposable income. They populate the shopping malls, and they're much more in the public space. So that is formally what happened. But if you go one step deeper in terms of what's going on in everyday life, women's status and how they're treated, I think there's so many examples of this deeply entrenched misogyny. It's just the violence and child rape and the stories are really very hard to read sometimes. And that is the clash. I mean, on the surface, you have these waves, and you can probably talk about a positive trend. But the deep inside, there are these deeply entrenched practices that are still there. I think that isn't really, it's a big problem.
Susie, anything to add? You gave a great example of the Korean women, but other examples you want to add? Or?
Yeah, there's three things that I want to say. One is that, so if we think of articulations of nationalism being primarily formed by political elites, then that's already going to have gendered repercussions when a lot of the political elites tend to be men, right? So the articulations of nationalism might be constructed more so by men than by women. But then add on the religion component to that as well. And when you have religious authority primarily vested in men, then you're going to have men articulating religious forms of nationalism primarily as well. And I think that plays out in Myanmar, and that the construction of a Buddhist nationalism is primarily being done by male religious and political authorities, and perhaps because of that, in part, there's an obsession with women and women's bodies and women's rights that are components of that. Which gets to point two, which is that in Myanmar, there's a source of pride and a narrative about Myanmar being this sort of beacon of women's rights in Asia and in the world. And there is, within personal status laws within Myanmar, within the different tribal societies, there is a good deal of gender equality and women's rights that are a component of it that has often been lifted up, and is often sort of lifted up part and parcel with some of that xenophobic mentality too, right? So we're more advanced even than the West in terms of women's rights, is the narrative there during the anti-colonial period and during independence, and then it's articulated now with respect to the Muslim community. So we're more progressive when it comes to women's rights in the Islamic community, and we need to be careful about Muslims within Myanmar because they're going to bring their own cultural values and practices, particularly in how they treat women, to Myanmar, and going to unfurl the rights that women have, which gets to point three, which is that the romantic narrative of women, of the liberated women in Myanmar, doesn't really comport with the reality on the ground, where women are still face a great deal of structural discrimination that prevents them from serving in a lot of political positions, notwithstanding Aung San Suu Kyi, who is, of course, the daughter of the independence movement. And they face a great deal of violence. So one of the ironies, sexual violence, domestic violence, other forms of violence. So one of the ironies is that the Buddhist nationalist group, the Mabata, passed a series of laws that are called the Four Race and Religion laws, that they promoted these laws as being about protecting women, and protecting women from forced conversion, from forced marriage, from being forced to have many children. And in reality, the way it's played out is that these laws were passed, more Buddhist women have brought Buddhist husbands to courts for infidelity and polyamory than Muslim men have been brought to courts, because of course the violence and discrimination that women face within Myanmar doesn't come primarily or exclusively from the Muslim community. It just comes from men from all different communities, right?
Universal.
And when you look at the same time these laws were being advanced, there was a law that was being designed and pushed for, that was the anti-violence against women law, which wasn't getting a lot of support from the Buddhist nationalist communities, despite their, primary objective of trying to protect women. And when you look at the statistics of where are women facing the most forms of rape, including marital rape and other forms of sexual and domestic violence, it's within the majority community, which is the Buddhist community. Yeah. So even these sort of romantic notions that that are at the heart of the construction of religious nationalism that are very gendered don't really comport with the reality on the ground, which is not to say, and this will be my final point, that women, including Buddhist women, Buddhist nuns, are very involved in some of these constructions of the narratives themselves. And so Buddhist nuns have been some of the most active kind of foot soldiers for the Buddhist nationalist groups, which they see as a feminist act. They are doing this in order to defend women. They are doing this to participate in a religious movement where they might have a degree of authority that they don't have within the formal Buddhist structures, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot to unpack on gender and on women specifically within the religious nationalist movement in Myanmar.
Excellent. I know we have a question here, we have a question there. We probably have a lot more, but I'm conscious of our time. So let me just take both questions and then we'll go through our panel and then we will wrap it up.
Thank you. My name is Greg Mitchell and I co-chair the International Religious Freedom Roundtable here in Washington. A lot of participants of the roundtable in the room here. Chris Seifel was the co-founder. He's the founding co-chair still, and I'm the managing co-chair. But real quick, I just wanted to see developments that haven't been discussed here yet, that this administration has committed itself to international religious freedom, and they've done the ministerial. The Secretary of State hosted the big ministerial to advance religious freedom in July. That's going to be an annual meeting now, and the vision that's coming out of that is that they're also going to be supporting the vision of regional conferences in between the annual ministerials, and then a global network of roundtables, like based loosely on the IRF roundtable model here, which is multi-faith, it's inclusive, it's an equal citizenship model. Susie's been there, a lot of people here have been there. They see how it works here. So the question is, if you've got the U.S. government leading this ministerial, there's a global network of governments, the International Contact Group, there's a global network of parliamentarians, the International Panel
If I
of
can just ask you to ask your question so I can get the other question and we can get through.
So adding a civil society network to that equation and supporting the establishment of civil society roundtables in countries, possibly India, I know it's going to be harder in Myanmar and Turkey and some of the others, but do you think that would work if you have 3 global networks coordinating with each other, communicating with each other? And here's the key, these aren't roundtables set up to oppose the government, but to work with the government, engage the government, top down, bottom up engagement.
Excellent, great question. Other questions back,
really
and then
quickly.
we'll go through our panel.
Well, thank you so much. Learned a lot. I'm ethnically Indian. So by the way, I'm Tahara again. I'm the Director of Interfaith Engagement at Northwestern University and Associate Chaplain. Also second generation Turk, so share both of that. So I'm interested in the question on India. I think it's unique. I've invested a lot of time studying all 3 of these situations. But I think India is unique because of its history of, the idea of like what Akbar introduced, I'm sure during the Mughal Empire, right? Deen-e-Ilahi type of concept. And in the last, I would say 50 years or so, if you look at Bollywood, which is the largest film industry, right? The arts has played a major impact in terms of interfaith relations. A.R. Rahman comes out with, right?
So I'm gonna encourage you to get
so the
this for our
question
time
basically
here,
is,
so- yes.
do you see that like the arts playing a role in reviving that sense of like community and engagement and relationship building? Because the new gods of India are Muslim like artists. So like, it's kind of interesting.
Excellent. All right, so 2 great questions. One, this model of a global network on the civil society and governmental level that is looking to create that synergy and that collaboration between the 2. And then is the arts, particularly in the India case, a way to engage? Why don't we start with Susie and we'll go this way. You can touch on, would this model be a helpful tool in the toolkit?
I think it could be helpful, and one of the things that I think is most helpful about some of these exchanges is, for example, the Buddhist majority in Myanmar to understand how Buddhist minorities experience discrimination in places like Bangladesh, for example, or elsewhere in the United States, and being able to, that allows them then to put themselves, to empathize better with how minorities in their experience. And then it can play off that pride that Buddhists have, that we are a peaceful, non-discriminatory, modern religion that is very in keeping with human rights and so on. Once they are able to reflect back on the way in which Buddhism is kind of infused with the state in ways that are discriminatory there.
Excellent.
I think, I mean, the civil society networks, I mean, something like that might be helpful. The challenge will be to make sure that it's not perceived as a network that is designed to protect Christians, basically. And that will be the perception, and that would be, really with local participation, reflecting the situation in local countries, etc. That will be important. Art, again, to go back to earlier comments, I mean that certainly it's possible, and in Turkey you don't have a Bollywood style, I mean, a scale movie industry. But as you probably know, in recent years, what you can call sort of the artsy films, in Turkey became quite successful. They're very prominent in the national competitions, etc. But the fact of the matter is that very few people in Turkey really watch them. So it's and as such, it's not really either a vehicle for social change, or at the same time, it's not seen as a threat to anybody's power for the time being. But the Indian situation is different.
Yeah. So maybe if you can comment on the structure of a global and regional network structure, and then
Sure.
I'd love to hear.
I'll start with what's
Bollywood.
part of my DNA, which is Bollywood.
I didn't know that.
And I think in an earlier generation, you could make films where a mother gives birth to triplets, and one ends up adopted by a Christian family and a Hindu family and a Muslim family, and they're known as Amar, Akbar, and Anthony. Today's films, of course, the male leads many of the most famous male leads are of Muslim origin, but they're not necessarily cognized as Muslims. And increasingly, they don't step out of line saying certain kinds of things which would emphasize their Muslim identity. I think that's changed over time. So, and even though the language of Bollywood, particularly the romancing, is in Urdu, people don't necessarily think of, oh, I'm participating in something that is beyond my own. Rather, it's part of your popular culture. As for the possibility of the sort of initiative started here being extended to India, I think it's really difficult in the case of India for anything to come from the outside, particularly from the United States, particularly in the realm of religion, to be able to say anything to Indian stakeholders who would be interested. So I think you could have elites participate in these kinds of high-level kinds of seminars and workshops, but I think at the popular level, you really need the initiative to come from the grassroots level.
Well, a fascinating discussion. I'm sure we could continue for hours, if not days. A lot of important lessons about homegrown, bottom-up narratives, the importance of institutions and structures that are inclusive of all of the people in these very diverse and complex societies, and the need to continue to work to create that space. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thanks to all of you. We're going to take a short break until about 3 o'clock. So not that short, actually longer than we've given you the rest of the day. And then we would like you to come back for a closing working group discussion that will be participatory for about 45 minutes. So enjoy your break.
Yeah. Called Alpha. I had to ask him about it. You knew I sure I was going to say hello there too. We had to mention how, like, actually that's what we're trending more towards the national right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Really, but I think it's
Have you started? Why?
If you ever want to listen with earplugs,
Some of them experts.
I mean, that's the hard part in all of these situations. We sort of know where our countries to get to, but it can only society for responsible competition. And in many countries, society tells us Turkey is being so selfish in their days, and then responsible competition for lacking in
I've read all the bits. Really good. Yeah, watch the guy.
I want to ask them a question. So
It kind of came out. Like, have a unitary state.
it's doing a lot of things.
I mean, yeah, I mean, you're right,
The state
actually.
itself.
Once Erdogan really combined this Muslim nationalist region, that is really 80%.
Yeah. Like, how are you?
Gently liberal way of doing it.
She said that. You know what I mean? That's right.
Everywhere,
Right. And that's the same thing that we're doing here, right?
Just check.
So my question is,
So I think it's
The next generation,
if anybody
out whether there's a specific
but then the government has to know.
and I'm wondering, I don't know if it's a demographic that you've all studied as well, but I'm wondering if you're seeing sort of a growing cynicism or a growing misunderstanding or lack of faith because they're seeing
everyone was a minority. You could, the society was cut enough different ways that you were a minority, but you were part of different groups. Whereas now it's like,
because they're trying to get out
or not.
They threaten,
And that's it.
And in
Played that card.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to challenge
Yes,
There is some context. Like in the United States.
China, Korea.
I will tell you that.
And I don't
Yeah, I have seen it. I know.
Nói ông là Thanh Hai mình có một cái hội thảo đề tài 30
I think I'm not just worried.
When I'm
Much
He was something
India still, I think, is
tôi cần cái email để gửi thư mời team.
Trong
quốc hội Hoa Kỳ.
So I don't think we protect it as much. We sit there because
Wow.
So,
he was lucky to get out early. Otherwise, he would have to just because he's
so one of the ways I can
vừa rồi mình có tổ chức một cái hội nghị 32 sắc tộc 7 tôn giáo ở
most of my friends even now, Michigan. Hindu, Muslim.
Glad you're home. Yes. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Hindus and Indian.
Brilliant.
The person. If I put you down, they don't big. And so that gives me hope. Okay,
around the
those are.
And it's gotten violent.
But
on the personal level,
generally there is not. I don't see like tensions. They have pretty extreme tensions. But even if they get along fine, it's not this kind of fun. I have a group of friends that are
The diaspora or in
Michigan.
And
mythology become a dirty word, but it's not.
we have big issues.
But if it's a challenge when you don't acknowledge the fact that right?
Yeah, we have.
To me, these things aren't through.
So we have a big grudge. At least we are very honest. Because they keep sending all these articles like stuff.
Problem there's no two problem.
No, I mean they support it. You know, our dynamic in Afghanistan is they basically sided with Taliban or the government decided. It's just weird. So our relationship at this point has been Pakistan.
Never done this on my own, but again, that's what I think.
It's really intense. Our engagement really, I am one of those guys
We need her. She I'm like 17.
You know what it was? It's triggered like, and I was like, I know. But it triggers us to teach how to navigate.
Gates are for all the work it does. They don't have higher lives too often. Also,
I'm not sure. There's a lot of
I know.
Oh, that's right. Nature. You took care of all the like.
Great, great.
So I'm animated today only because it's the 7th person.
part of their idea is that they want to integrate their together with consortiums. They don't want restrictions.
No, the fun
Not that much harder. You can't do that.
John.
How are you doing today?
So my struggle, and you help me to go with it, it's a big firm, all 17 of those people.
I understand. That's my colleague.
You gave her the 4 good things. I got the better advice since you asked me. Thanks for sharing the 4, because you keep it up. And I will try to keep my animation about it down, because I am. But nothing would. My favorite thing is
Oh, nice. All right. I went to high school.
even I make mistakes. I'm trying to.
But now I live in DC. And I run an organization.
I mean, I experience it.
We are a coalition-based group that's trying to address discrimination against Muslims and those perceived from Arab populations in the American West. By trying to work with to better connect neighbors to neighbors in local communities and then better connect students to their local communities. Trying to get married and have that doesn't work so well. And so this work partially overlaps with my time at the Religious Freedom Center. And all the ways that we think about the importance of Twitter well, the folks are very kind, but tell me about what to the museum. And I consider it sort of an incubation technique where I'm developing new initiatives that touch on priorities that are listed on those different things. So in particular, thinking about development of new resources, updated case studies about the impacts on the communities of bigotry and discrimination to like be added to the museum education, online portal, and that kind of thing. And because I'm connected to a network of trying to pull them into working with the center. So it's a very like cross pollination type of I didn't speak because I wanted to be a little about
And also, this is big difference.
I would totally agree. No. I've done my hair. I did my
So with the leading class, because we're focused on all so yes, I could definitely I know you want to go back. Okay. Oh, thank you too. Thank you. Making sure you get your break. Yes, thank you, Yusra. I appreciate it. Excuse me. Oh, it's nice. I've been here now, let's see, almost 4 years. So, I'm quite home for myself and my husband. I live not too far from here. So, particularly in the community. So, I live just a couple blocks down from where and a Jewish synagogue and a bunch of churches, a number of churches, like, you know, Catholic, so it's a really nice community, and I grew up doing education, and so it's nice to come here. You know, just right? I used to live in Rogers Park, just for a couple of years, and then my family's still out there, so I go there. And I really miss it, since, you know, DC doesn't compare to Chicago. DC is kind of, for lack of a more articulate term, icky, yeah, exactly. Oh my gosh, I think you said it better yourself. So that I don't quite appreciate. It's hard to have to change that lasts longer than. And so the pace of it is not really enjoyed. He works for the year. He's ITM. He can go anywhere. In fact, I can go. Thank God. I can very mobile. So I'm supposed to, you know, I was catching him on email. I should probably, so I think my work that you find when you work because our work is domestic and it's with anything in Congress, anything in federal. And so I also have been thinking about, well, it would be nice to get back out there. Oh my God, I grew up with those things. I don't mind.
Just scale in different ways. It was pretty neat. And we all talk about it.
Absolutely.
Right. So I and my mother.
That's a lot of money. And I say that that's a lot of money. More money. Really just what lots of people do, but with many more zeros. I don't have my own.
I did.
And also email. Like the social good they're trying to have. Right? They try to engage in other ways.
It's a J something.
They're basically doing the same thing. I mean, there's been a lot of just saying, where are you going to head out there? Serendipitous, yeah, that's great. So, it's going to take some time. All right. Okay, great. Yeah, we don't have the data yet on the last few, of course. Right? It won't be next. But I mean, take it with what's the
I kind of want to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, I don't have time.
Also that guy,
Thank you, I appreciate it. Great, thanks, sir.
It's a feel like you're at Now, the argument.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Thank you for sticking with us all day. We know it's been a long day with a lot of deep conversation. We're going to start with kind of a little interactive exercise, which is that we want you to talk to one another for about 5 minutes. So just kind of huddle with the people closest to you, groups of 4 or 5, and maybe people that you don't know or didn't come with, and talk about what are the resonant themes of the day for you, and then we'll use that feedback and data as a jump-off point in the conversation for Chris and I to summarize the day. So you have until 3:06. So just gather with the people around you, people you don't know. You go for it. It was Bree's idea.
I'm just gonna go around with What do you guys think?
I want to create a vision of no way. Build institutions that protect my rights.
So what did you think?
Invest in the structures that allow us.
Wow, I feel like so that shift from nonprofit to philanthropy feels a little bit different, but there's also so many years. Not that all right. What are the plans for the fundraising? Because they know that link.
Before today, the last
But I sound complicated. Like cautionary tale. We did our first positive idea and like
like you loved it. I love it. We had
what am I doing? I want to do it again.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be. That's right, it is.
Yeah, that's fun.
My eyes are blushing.
Take about a minute to conclude your conversation.
One minute, 10 minutes.
All right. All right, everybody, I think we're ready to reconvene. We hope you had some good preliminary conversation, and we're wondering if you'd like to share some reflections. Maybe one person from the group can share what you talked about and or speak from your own personal experience about resonant themes of the day. So let me see hands if there are any volunteers. Does anybody want to share what they just discussed? No, you're all talked out. Yes, please.
Hi, Greg Mitchell, the International Religious Freedom Roundtable. Just it's related to what I was saying in the last panel that we were discussing here. What we were hearing earlier is the need for, we were even hearing safe spaces and tables, right? Where everybody has a seat at the table. All minority communities have a seat at the table. So everyone's there, nobody's marginalized, nobody's alienated. So we were just talking about, in the last panel, there was a discussion of these roundtables, a global network of these roundtables, but we were also agreeing that a global network of, like a domestic network of roundtables like this, multi-faith, inclusive, equal citizenship roundtables around the U.S. would also help, meeting on an ongoing basis. Just because, again, we heard earlier the need for safe spaces and tables where everyone can gather to discuss these issues and come up, find the common ground and work together.
Thank you. Others want to share?
Randy Thompson with the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies. What we kind of came to was a question by Bree about what's the common drivers behind the three cases, the cases that we just heard about in India and Turkey, as well as in the United States. Is there some common process that these leaders are responding to and that has allowed for them to rise in somewhat similar timelines? And we kind of came around to the idea that there may be some kind of a backlash to globalism that's at play in all of these places, as people are really politicizing parochial identities that have that power to move people because they are in opposition to a global identity that is kind of denuded of cultural aspects, right? It's that everybody will basically benefit from development, that universal human rights are the path forward, that all of these in some ways are reactions against that. Not particularly hopeful at all, which is what you were hoping for, but that's what we discussed.
That's great, thank you. Others, anyone from this side of the room? Yeah. Allison's coming with the mic.
So we were talking about just this need that became very apparent, and a lot of different people talked about, to have these spaces where people can come together around the table. And these three women are significantly younger than me, and so we were asking them, so have you had these opportunities in your education? And it was clear that you really had to seek it out and didn't always know where to find it. So there might be an academic component, but if you really wanted to find a round table or a place to explore, it was really hard to find that. And I think that's significant. Thank you.
Yeah. Chris, I'm going to turn over to you. Oh,
Yeah.
we have one more? Oh, yeah.
Sabrina Dent with the Religious Freedom Center. One of the things that we talked about was in the panel discussion. Well, one of the things that I was saying is, how do we get this information filtered out to other people than the usual people that are in the room, where it goes out to a larger context. But at the same time, in what Mark talked about earlier, Mark Charles, when he was talking about narratives, is that, you know, how do we get it so that people become not comfortable with, but comfortable with being uncomfortable with those narratives that they're not familiar with, and not willing to gloss over those, but really wrestle with them and with the significance and the meaning. And so Kent was asking, well, what do you hope is the larger goal for him? And I said, well, acknowledgement is a first step. And then including those stories in the larger narrative to raise the visibility of them is so important.
Agree.
Afternoon, Elizabeth with Sojourners. Randa and I, both moms of young children, were talking, and I was reflecting on the role that education of very young children plays. And I know earlier we heard about children's storybooks, and I'm just so, all the talk we've talked about here, roundtables and so forth, so important, but really educating our children. And where are the coalitions working on curriculum development and standards and textbooks? And I know where it is on maybe the other side, but I don't hear as much from folks who are trying to help build this common memory. And I'm really interested in that. So if you have resources toward that end, I'd be glad to talk to you afterward.
Just a plug for our report. We do have some stuff listed in that pluralism and peril report. I mean, this is something we think about a lot, and try to get curriculum developers together to work together, kind of so that they can look at different, who's covering which population. And so, yeah, we're happy to talk offline about that.
Okay. My job is to try and summarize this very deep and somewhat heavy conversation a little bit before Zeenat makes me look smarter than I am. A number of things are in my head, and I think I'm grateful that you have stayed this long. I mean, you're the converted, you're the chosen, you're the choir. The choir has been expanded, and that's good. Tyler Deaton said we're preaching to the choir too much, but Bree offered a rejoinder to that, which is it's okay for the saints to get more saintly. And I think that's an important point. The saints, the choir, whatever the religious tradition metaphor is, it needs to deepen and expand and be equipped. But more importantly than being equipped, sometimes it needs to be encouraged. And if anything, for me today, this was a day of encouragement because it's a much more diverse crowd than we've traditionally seen, or I've traditionally seen in DC or in other places. And that's just fantastic. So a few points that are on my mind that I'll try to illustrate in terms of summary, but through my own experiences. So I used to work for a group called the Institute for Global Engagement and worked amidst Asian authoritarianism for the last 17 years or so. And my number one takeaway from that experience was that whatever the issue was, it always boiled down to majority-minority relations, wherever I was. And the human condition simply is this, is that the ethno and or religious majority treats the ethno and or religious minority poorly. It's sad, but that's just the case. And so back to Tyler, the question becomes, how do you find, or how do you give permission, and this gets to Josh Good's point a little bit about thick pluralism, how do you give permission to those who belong to the ethno-religious majority to live out the very best of their faith when they're having a cultural, political context that says we ought to demonize, otherize the people who don't look or vote or act or pray like we do? And that speaks to this concept of scriptural literacy or knowing your own narrative. What is it about the best of your values that can be, and what does it say about the other? But the point is, the ethno-religious majority, they set the pace for culture, whether you like it or not, in any given country. And there has to be a place where they can give permission, and there has to be a place for what people in my tradition, the Christian tradition, would call prophetic voice. a prophetic voice to remind you to the best of what our values are in order to love, engage your neighbor. So that's very important in terms of understanding the majority in any given context. It's not an excuse, by the way. It's just to say this is what humans unfortunately do. Now, the flip side of that is this. In all of those places, whether I was going with lowland Khmer people, Vietnamese, Buddhist, to highland ethnic minorities in Vietnam, or lowland Lao to highland Christian minorities in Laos or Burma, or lowland Han Chinese going to highland Tibetan Buddhist or Uyghur Muslims, if I were to summarize all those experiences, it would be this. We didn't know. The ethno-religious majority had no point of touch, literally, of familiarity with the experiences across generations, across centuries of the minority experience. So it doesn't make them bad people, but the point is, who are the good people that give them permission to be good people and begin to introduce these kinds of concepts and thinking about that. Now, let me say something that may be less popular. The other part of that experience is that you've got to have, and this is so hard to say, as someone from an ethno-religious majority in this particular country, you have to have ethno-religious, I hate the term minority, non-majority leaders who step up and don't start with their hate or their legitimate, genuine feelings of oppression as the starting point of the conversation. That's so hard to do. If you've engaged diasporan communities, for example, in this country, they remain when they were at the place where they left. Cubans are in 59, Tibetans are in 59, Vietnamese are in 75. And it's so hard to get them to move past the oppression of the experience that they genuinely experience.
And the legitimacy of that
And the
experience.
legitimacy of it, yeah, it's not a perception. It's real. But who among them can step forward and remind the majority of their better angels, as it were? That's a difficult process to go through and identify. Then it takes bravery. And you know what? Those folks who step up and do that are going to take fire. They're going to take fire from the political and theological left and right because they're going against the norms and ironically often living with the best of their values of their faith tradition by working on conciliation or reconciliation. Second big point. Susie has left, Susie Hayward, who was speaking on Myanmar, but she and I have an affinity for the Red Sox, which is why I wore this tie today, because I knew she was going to be here, and we love the Red Sox. And I knew win or lose last night. I know all of you followed the Red Sox-Yankees game last night. I was going to stand with her. Now, it's also true that the Red Sox killed the hated Yankees 16-1 last night, which gives me immeasurable joy in terms of how things happen. But all of that to say is this. And what I heard in every conversation is it's so much harder to have an intra-tribe conversation before you have an intra-faith conversation, before you have a multi-faith conversation. The conversation about whether Brock or Mookie is better on the Red Sox is much more fierce than whether we hate the New York Yankees. And it's a much easier conversation to love baseball than love American football, obviously, right? So having that intra-conversation and being equipped to have those skills is really, really critical. And now this also speaks to our history and the mythology of our history or the history of our mythology or however you want to think about it. But other conclusion I've come to working around the world is the best of your future runs through your past. You don't have to make up your past, but there's something in your past, there's something in your culture, in your faith tradition that is about hospitality, that is about welcoming the stranger, that is about doing the right thing. Now, it so happens that the reason I like the Red Sox is because I grew up in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, near Foxborough. I'm a Red Sox and New England Patriots fan living in Seattle, which is a whole different kind of experience, intertribal experience. But the point I want to make here is this guy named Roger Williams. Roger Williams fled from Massachusetts, where I used to live, to Rhode Island because he refused, as a member of the ethno-religious majority, to be defined by that ethno-religious majority in terms of who he could worship. And what's crazy about this, and this is a conversation I'd love to have with Mark Charles, is Roger Williams fled west to the Indians because he had a safe place, because he was in a previous relationship out of mutual respect. He learned their language. He surveyed it. He paid them for the land. He didn't do it despite his faith, but because of his faith. He says, I'm not any less of a Christian if I love the neighbor, somebody who is totally different than me. I'm required to do that. It's a command. How could I do anything less? And oh, by the way, to Mark's point, he says it back on the record in 1644, it's wrong for the King of England to give away lands that aren't his. So there's a narrative there and an anchor point for a new understanding about what took place here in America. And American exceptionalism is not about geography or the ethno-religious majority. In my mind, American exceptionalism is that 51% of the time we get it right because we have the capacity to self-critique and therefore self-correct. And understand that the table belongs to nobody. And the more chairs, the better. Absolutely critical. Last point of summary in terms of what I heard practically and where I think we need to go. And you'll forgive me, but I'm addicted to alliteration. And of course, there's got to be 3 points, as any Protestant pastor will tell you. But the first is literacy, the second is local, and the third is location in terms of how do we move forward. The number one theme seemed to be literacy. And for me, literacy, before you even get to skill sets, literacy is about humility. Literacy means I don't have all the answers with certitude, and therefore you need to look and vote like me. You need to be assimilated, which is what Massachusetts wanted to do, and not integrate, which is what Roger Williams did in Rhode Island, because everybody got a seat at the table. Literacy is about getting the questions right or knowing where to go to get the questions right so you don't make a fool of yourself when you're engaging the other. And so there are specific skill sets that are related to that we're developing at the University of Washington's Cross-Cultural Religious Literacy Program. Those skill sets are communication, evaluation of self and of the context, communication, verbal and nonverbal, and negotiation. My own identity, by the way, and then how that identity changes and transforms as it engages other identities. You have to have skill sets related to literacy if you're going to be equipped to expand the choir. There's just no getting around that. And that can be taught. Those are tangible skill sets. And to the point that was made about college is too late. It's true. K through 12. What Kristen is doing at Center for Religious Freedom is just imperative. How do we get it at kindergarten levels and begin to understand those kinds of skill sets? We absolutely need to have that going forward. So that's literacy. The local piece is the other key. There's so many times where the American shows up, the gringo shows up, and here's my 3-year plan, and here are all the quantitative metrics, right, according to the best of what donors are trying to intend, which is a whole nother conversation.
Wow.
Tomorrow. But local is key. People live in a local environment. They don't live in a single issue. We have the luxury of single issues. Let's go promote religious freedom, but nobody lives in a religious freedom silo overseas. They live in a messy mosaic where religious freedom is number 15 on a list of 10. How do you meet those needs, and how do you find different ways to honor self-interest and needs in a way that reflects reconciliation and the dignity of everybody at a table that they don't own? We got to include the local, and that has to be lifted up. Absolutely has to be lifted up. It can't be, here come the Westerners, here come the NATO people, here come whatever you want to say. Local, there's always a tradition of reconciliation, of hospitality of the other. And then the last one I want to say and emphasize is the location. And we touched on this a little bit, and there's a whole developing field on it, but location matters, and not just in terms of political perception, but in terms of the physical infrastructure. I mean, look at the way this building was designed in this space. You can look out, whether you're Christian or religious or not, you see a beautiful building across this expanse. There's a literal transparency to the openness of this room and as it looks out over Washington, D.C. That's a much more comfortable location than being at the JW Marriott downstairs in the cellar at the bottom of an escalator that has no windows, which is where a lot of conferences get held. Makes no sense. But the point is there has to be mutually reinforcement about the location and how it's perceived by the relevant stakeholders and people who own the chairs and the physical infrastructure. It has to be an encouraging space to be safe and to share different thoughts and our deepest theological divides. So when we say, hey, we have differences about X, Y, or Z theologically, but that doesn't mean I love you any less. It means I love you all the more. And that can be encouraged in the context of a physical space that is thought through in the context of the political perceptions of the people who are coming to the table. So those are the things that I think point us in a direction moving forward. Literacy and skill sets of evaluation, communication, and negotiation, location, and above all, local, because the local will determine the characteristics of what the location looks like, and it will determine the characteristics of the curriculum that teaches the skill sets that are necessary. Because again, every location has a metaphor or a tradition that allows for the golden rule. And if you can't find it, you're not looking hard enough. So I'll stop there by way of summary and return the floor to Madam Zinat.
So I will have more disjointed thoughts than that, but happy to kind of offer my reflections of the day. As I look across the room, I see so many of us who've been in this space for a decade or more. And that's just a reminder that this work is generational and there are no silver bullets, and often we come together in days or panels and we want a solution at the end of it that's in a book, and it's not going to happen. But I think, so what I'd like to just kind of surface some of the ideas and maybe questions that we have, and orient it around what thematically we are framing the day as, right, which is conscience, citizenship, and community. And I think we were able in all of the panels to see that like thread through on every single one of those things. And so I'm going to start with citizenship because throughout the day we talked a lot about narratives, right? And I think we're in the middle of an American project, which is, what does a new civil religious narrative look like that reflects all of the religious diversity of this country? And that's not a given. I think the question is, can we even get there? Because it's never been tested that way before. It's only been, an ethno-religious majority who've had to, the people who have been absorbed into that narrative have been, have done it through assimilation, right? Have not done it because they are radically different or add something different to that narrative. And so I think that's a question of, stories, as was mentioned. How do young people see themselves? How do young citizens of this country see themselves? How do we see one another? And how do we build that if that's something that we want? And I thought, Mark Chell's work is really interesting because I think we need to start from a place, and Reverend Carruthers in the morning, of acknowledging the real story of our country and how it was founded and what that means and the repercussions of that moving forward. Because if we don't acknowledge those things in the past, and that's probably why we find ourselves stuck on so many issues, we won't be able to move forward, right? One thing that Bree kind of brought up in our conversation and then surfaced in your thing are looking across the global context. We kind of find ourselves in a similar moment, and when you talk about or think about India, and you think about the United States and different leaders, there seems to be kind of a swing, towards this autocracy and towards division. And so what are the things that, in terms of like listing the symptoms, why are we here in this place? And what should we look for, in the future to not end up stuck in this place or not be back in this place? So what are the common what are the drivers, what are the symptoms to why we are facing, so much division across many different ways? You guys said globalization, maybe. My sense is it's probably a multitude of drivers or reasons. So that's kind of citizenship. I think on the community piece, we actually had a lot of good things surface today, and not surprisingly, right? Because this is an expert crowd. This is people who know what they're talking about. So we talked about religious literacy, about humility and empathy, the ability to listen, the ability to understand complexity. I thought Rabbi Holtzman, kind of diagnosed something that's not just about religious pluralism, but actually goes beyond just to again, civics and citizenship and what does it mean to be, an American, and our understanding of that, and at what age do we start absorbing those narratives? And I have a 3-year-old too, so I was horrified to know that your kid is already facing bullying, but you see those kind of symbolic things kind of begin to happen at a very young age. And so when we talk about this idea of community, yeah, we need many different tables in many different places. They're not going to all be normative. They're not going to look the same. We can't have we actually can't have a cookie cutter approach because every situation is so different. Something that Simran had mentioned in his panel. But what I noticed kind of resonant throughout the panels is that there is no infrastructure by which to house these. So we had Rabbi Holzman tell us that really moving story about his community stepping up for the Muslim community in Virginia and Ruston in a moment of great trauma, around the murder of a young girl, and how they were able to do that because they had already laid the groundwork and they already had that relationship, and so that they were able to kind of really show that resilience in that community, or because they already had that muscle memory of knowing one another. So you have that, and you have many examples, I think, of that. And if we went around the room, we could probably all come up with some. And then you have these conversations that we kind of find ourselves in, which are national and international. And there's like a big part missing in between, and I don't know what that is, but I know we need to build that scaffolding because this is what I struggle with. I have great grassroots examples that I can point to as a one-off. And then we come into these rooms and we have conversations about scale, but there's no bridging happening between those two things. And I don't know what that means. I don't know if that means community-based, city-based, state-based, national, subnational, but I know that that's missing. And I think it's something funders think about. It's something, in the places that I sit, we think about as well, and maybe it just means that like looking at the intervention, the long-term solutions for this stuff is not going to happen on a national level, right? But it's really to help build the top-down infrastructure, or I don't mean top-down, but I mean look at this infrastructure that can connect the two. And my colleague Allison said yesterday, connect the grass tops to the grassroots sometimes, I think is really critical and necessary work. I think that might be all of my points. And then on conscience, I totally agree. I've totally bought into your, what do you call it, covenantal pluralism, multi-faith literacy. But I think starting from a place of knowing your own faith and what it says about engaging other traditions. And that's something that minority traditions have, especially in this country, have had really a disproportionate responsibility put upon them to do that. And I do think that, I think the majority, I think somebody said this in one of our panels, it's like it's on the majority to kind of reach out because it's impossible for 7% of the population to reach everybody. To do my Pal is just not, it's not doable. And so, but I think starting from a place of, seeing religion as a force for good and also not stereotyping the religious majority, which also happens in minority circles, to say like they are all like that, right? But starting from a place of religion being dynamic, that everybody's experience is a different part of like the broader strand of a religion, and then considering kind of the multi-diverse religious country that we live in. How do all of those things inform the common good? So I think a big takeaway for me is really to think about institutions more and what is this role of institutions, particularly because I feel like they've failed us in a way. And then how do we build that scaffolding and that infrastructure? Yeah, and I'll leave it with that. Do you want to leave it with something more uplifting? A quote?
Well, I'd say, is there any reaction from the audience to any of what we've said or what you heard from each other before we adjourn? Any last comments? Anand?
Just a quick comment about globalization. I think from where Asia sits, it has a very different perspective on globalization. China is at the forefront of embracing globalization, as is India, as are many of the countries in Asia, because it really affords an opportunity. They have the kinds of economies that are going to benefit from changes that are forthcoming. I think what we miss out on that scaling, and I think a number of people have talked about this, is kind of who commands the structures of power and who's holding on to the levers of power. We can do a lot at the community level, at the local level, but unless you have states and their policies supportive of these initiatives, they're never going to get beyond a certain level. And if states are increasingly becoming authoritarian, it's very difficult to foster the kinds of changes many people would love to see happen.
Right.
Thank you. That's an important point.
So I was just going to say.
Wait for the mic.
I'm coming. Sorry, Allison.
Hi, I'm Nadia with Democracy Fund. First of all, thank you for the whole day. And I just wanted to add, maybe for the scope of the conversation tomorrow, with respect to what you were saying about needing people from the minority communities to have a handout, so to speak, to be able to be reached to. What is it that we as funders are doing to support those communities to be able to do so when the funding disproportionately doesn't go to them? How is it that we can sort of think through our grant making and more to support those communities to be able to accept that hand?
Good night.
In the far back.
Leo with the State Department. Again, I'd like to thank you. It was a wonderful day. But one topic that wasn't really talked about was the media. And in like India, Burma, Turkey, the media has been co-opted in many ways. And here in our own media, we still have a free press, but truth seems to be kind of a fungible thing. And how do we get pluralism in the media? In the old days, we had Martin Luther King, we had people who came from what you're talking about, a place of wanting being a minority, coming up not with hate, with a solution, with a positive approach. Now we've got maybe the Dalai Lama as an example of that kind of person, but and he's in the media, and it's just how can we bring that positive pluralism into more public, a more public forum. It used to be there more than it is today. So we have some local groups, and how can we puncture, because like the need to puncture the walls of the echo chambers and bring some reality and truth, real truth, real truth in there. And it's a question, how do we do it? It's a challenge. And I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but it's important, I think, to reach out through like film, news media, cable, and not just specific, this is the evangelical channel. It's like people who can speak to everybody. I don't know.
Why don't we take a shot? Yeah, I'll throw a few comments out.
Along the same lines, I also wanted to mention that this is probably one of the rare events I attended where social media didn't come up, because that has become such a big force now, obviously. I mean, all we can do, a lot on the local level, trying to foster communication with people we know, we want to know. But at the same time, most of those individuals are part of this other network, which can actually work in exactly the opposite direction than what we are trying to accomplish. So that's a big reality. I think that is really something that needs to be thought about in these forums. And then the co-optation of media, of course, the more traditional media is a big problem, in definitely in Turkey. Now the TV, both news but also cultural programs are very heavily dominated with this perspective that's very much in the service of the government and its priorities.
Let's take that one more question.
Rabbi Rigoberto Viñas. I am the rabbi of a Hispanic Jewish congregation, a multinational congregation. I'm very encouraged by what I listened to today. And one of the areas that was particularly encouraging was the area of the exploration of the intra-tribal conversation. It appears from my experiences, some of them positive, many, many, many negative, that as we try to expand the way that people stereotype or think about even who is included within each one of those tribes, within each one of those communities, that the conversation becomes the search for finding a leader who can oversimplify who's who. And it appears to me that often I think one of the most powerful comments was from my friend, Mr. Majid here, who said that hate works. And it seems to me that hate often simplifies the way people perceive each other. And so really, it's to express gratitude for today, and also to say that many times what we're doing is, what we're presenting is a more complicated vision of the world, where there are similarities and differences, and we're not glossing over the differences. In fact, we're exposing those differences, and then also saying that at the same time that we agree that there are differences, that there's a unifying force, which is the unifying force of love. And so that intra-tribal conversation and the power of the religious community to be able to speak once again, instead of to political power and to organizational power, to be able to invite people to think larger than themselves, to come out of that fractionalized system, I think really is one of the major conversations that I heard today and that I'm very grateful for.
Thank you.
Thanks. And Kent, maybe get the last word before we'll wrap up. Behind you, Allison.
Yeah.
Kent Hill, Religious Freedom Institute. 3 quick points. I'm struck by something that Chris Stewart said in the opening minutes of our time together. He said the reason the Templeton folks were interested in religious freedom was because it seemed to be an indispensable condition for pluralism. And the reason pluralism matters is because there's empirical evidence that when pluralism is present, the society is much more likely to be peaceful. The threat to neighbors is less. So there seems to be some connection between pluralism and more peaceful societies, which is why we're interested in that. That brings me to the second point. The key point here is if you're going to have pluralism, it all depends on how you treat the other. And we've got to remember that the other is not just minorities. The other can be majorities. The other is the other. Wherever we happen to be, we have to ask ourselves profound questions about how we feel about majorities, how we feel about minorities, etc. And that brings me to my third point. What is the basis we have to look for to somehow promote a view of the other that will result in pluralism? And the answer, I think, is human dignity. One way or the other, we have to find, either within our religious traditions or our worldviews, we have to find something that we believe deeply in, whether it's looking back, as you said, Chris, to something, the best part of our tradition, wherever it is, it's there someplace. If we don't access that and then operationalize that, we won't have the human dignity that we know is how we've got to look at the prism we've got to look at the other with. So I think in looking forward toward promoting pluralism, we've got to find a way to promote the common good by figuring out a way to somehow unleash against all the incivility and polarization of the moment, recapture the human dignity of the other, even though they're a different tribe, or different policy, a different political view. We've got to somehow see them as people again, and not as just an extraction, of some political or religious view.
Quick intervention.
Yeah. What was one more?
No, you just have a quick intervention.
Yeah. Agree. My thing about the Red Sox and arguing Brock versus Mookie is more fierce. I mean, to your point, what Bob Roberts is going through is much more fierce than anything between and among Christian traditions or Christian and other faith traditions. And those are the people that you got to pray for if you're the praying type. And I think the people who are in the intra-tribe conversation who can speak up against the wrongs according to the best of that tribe's values, that's the prophetic voice. That's the one that needs to be encouraged. And it's also, those people need to be encouraged. The most serious scars that Bob has, I've walked with Bob for a long time, and myself in the Christianity is from fellow Christians. And I'm sure it's the same with other traditions, that somehow your orthodoxy of your faith is questioned because you're talking to somebody who doesn't believe in the orthodoxy of your faith. That's scary. The two other quick points, and then we can wrap up. The other topic that brought up today was business. And business in the context of globalization in Asia is an opportunity. To Merrill's words, opportunities for encounter, business harnesses self-interest so you can literally move from the transactional to the transformational because there's an excuse for a relationship. And business CEOs are a ripe crowd to institutionalize such things in their own companies, but in a way that is practical and advances their brand, frankly. We're known for being this kind of brand, and I think there's a lot going on in that. There's a lot more that could come on that. The institutionalization of this, and this goes to Greg's point, what he said when there was three structures, he said very quickly. One is a structure between and among governments, which is kind of track one. Second, there's a structure, the interparliamentary panel of something or other. It's got some acronym that I can never remember. But elected legislative officials get together and talk about these things. But those are sort of in the top-down realm of the state institutions, which are critical, obviously, because they validate policies that become socialized. But the bottom up, which is really about the grass tops to the grassroots, is what Greg has been doing with the Religious Freedom Roundtable here, and we're beginning to see possibilities for that in other places around the world. Multi-faith, no faith at all, sitting regularly at the table. And that can become a point of conversation. The last thing, I don't want to end on a political note, but perhaps there's a certain irony to this administration pursuing this actively as a function of the State Department policy. It's real. Whatever your opinions are, they are trying to advance religious freedom roundtables around the world. And so there's an opportunity there as they work with other governments to speak into that context and say, let's see what this looks like. And oh, by the way, let's have an honest discussion about our own country and where we're going. So we should not shy away from that opportunity for encounter either as we go forward. But the bottom line, and this is to Zeena's point, individual stuff is key, but individuals make up institutions, and institutions have to remember why they were formed, because it's going to be the institutions of the state and the institutions of the grassroots that got to find a way to meet together on a regular basis in some of the structures that Greg and others are proposing. So,
thank you for the segue, because I'll take it, which is that those institutions need support, right? And they need funding, and it takes funders to make a long-term commitment and not just to look at funding programs or individuals, but rather looking at this again as a generational challenge, and that scaffolding that I was talking about isn't going to happen with the government, and it's not going to happen top down. It has to come from and be of civil society. And so I think foundations have to and funders in general have to think about their role within that. And I will end there, but I want to thank my colleagues, Allison, Ralph, who many of you got emails from, and Marty Morris, who's sitting outside, and Victoria, I don't know if she's still here today, who helped us for the day, without whom this program wouldn't have happened today. I'd like to thank Democracy Fund and Templeton Religion Trust for the support to be able to do this, and we hope this is not a one-off, but the first of several conversations we can have on this topic. And thank all of you, most of all, for being here today. So I hope you enjoyed, and we look forward to being in touch. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Jacqueline, come down.